From the Journal of Maria de Wint, Sister of the Bitter Well. August 15th. It has been 2 weeks since my sisters abandoned us for their new life in Jamestown. I pass by their house each day as I go to draw the water. It watches me, silent. I almost don't hate them for leaving. The air in the village is still heavy with the smell of sorrow and shame, and underneath it, whiffs of a lingering bloody-mindedness. Still, I expect we will miss their expertise in the weeks and months to come. The veil is thinned. We cannot predict what will come next. September 1st. As expected, strange seeds have taken root in this bloody soil. I am not sure I give much credence to the rumblings of dark figures seen in the woods. I am well versed in the simple tricks of the human imagination, but the stories from the harbor are something different. The sailors and fisherfolk have begun to tell tales of visions, hallucinations, impressions of uncomfortable things leering at them from archaic skiffs that drift noisily just outside the field of their vision. September 6th. Margaret, who is a fool, took Harold Miller's rowboat and rowed her fool ass out into the middle of the harbor last night. She at least had the good sense to bring a sachet of rosemary and a lock of hair from a hanged man, which is all too easy to come by at the moment. But even thus warded, it is pure luck she didn't end up drowned. I am not sure what to make of the experience she recounted to me. She said as the night passed, she began to grow nauseous. As the nausea progressed, she felt the pulse of her blood increase, the beat of her heart pounding in her ears, but the rhythm of it was wrong. It was musical, like a joyful tune tapped out on a drum. She said it was a song she recognized. And then she vomited. But what came out was not the lovely roast beets I had made us for dinner. What she disgorged onto the planks of Harold Miller's rowboat was something like a large fish, covered in fur. As she sat there in shock, this fur-bearing fish flopped its body to the edge of the boat and flung itself into the water, but not before smiling at her with a mouth full of wholly too human teeth, and whispering the words, "Adieu. I have too grieved a heart to take a tedious leave." I have commanded Margaret to several days of bed rest. We shall discuss this matter as a coven once she feels up to it. But I fear outside consultation may be in order.
Welcome to The Chimera, a role-playing adventure podcast. We're about to hop into our Season 3 pregame, but before we get to that, we'd like to take a quick moment to thank Sarah, GM of the wonderful 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons actual play podcast, Sacrosanct, for performing today's intro for us. You can find Sacrosanct on your preferred podcast app or at SacrosanctRP on Twitter. Now let's see exactly what it is that we're gonna do next.
That would require making a new file, though.
Yeah.
That we would all jump on. We cool with that? I can do that real quick.
Sure.
Yeah.
I'm open to it.
Uh-oh. I might have deleted the old map. No, I've got the map.
While Braden's doing that, does someone want to kind of explain what we're doing here?
Sure. So we are going to make use of the game rule set, The Deep Forest, which itself...
Sorry, not to... Before that, we should probably let people know what the general deal is with our deal at the moment.
Oh, yeah.
So we have had a bit of a change of plans regarding season 3. Josh is on sabbatical for a little while. So we're doing something different. Also, deep love to Josh.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. So we're going to do some World of Darkness stuff.
Yay!
So for those who aren't familiar with the World of Darkness, it's essentially a modern day system where you can play vampires and werewolves and ghosts and fairies and mummies and shit. You're not generally supposed to play all those at the same time, but consider who you're talking to. Of course, we're going to do that. Kelly's going to run that for us. Kelly just took off his headphones to go do something else in the room, so he has no idea that I'm talking about him.
No, I can still hear you through my headphones.
Awkward.
Have the volume turned up high enough. You can't get away with anything.
Dang it. Yeah, so that's the general gist. But before we hop into that, we're doing a little bit of world building. Oh, the other thing is that we have a pretty specific setting, which is that this game is taking place in the environs of the city of Salem, Massachusetts.
Yes, let's say Greater Salem, because that includes a whole bunch of the surrounding area that originally was at least theoretically part of the Salem colony and has since become separate towns and cities.
Yep. Where some of us live, but not all of us.
Right.
In real life.
Yeah.
That would be me. Braden Lamb.
And me.
I visited once.
Yeah, I was there very briefly once.
My knowledge is not deep.
It's a difficult place to get in and out of.
It is. My street is one of those ways.
So Vin is given the basic rundown. I'll say a little bit more about the setting concept here. So we are going to be making use of the original World of Darkness, canonical fluff, setting ideas, factional ideas about what the different types of monsters are and how they work and what they're for and what they're about. So kind of that's the baseline. We're going to be modifying that with ideas that were introduced in the new World of Darkness, the relaunch that they did several years ago. Since there are some ideas in there that I think are worth cannibalizing or cutting up for parts or extracting, and then further modifying with other additional ideas to fill in holes, plaster over things that I think are dysfunctional or silly past the point of being interesting silly. In general, my guiding ethos here is to try and bring a greater sense of a holistic quality to the various games, which especially in the original World of Darkness have very disparate feels and disparate assumptions, and arguably are really 5+ different types of game with pretty different assumptions that don't really harmonize very well, and so try to make things a little bit more harmonious. In part, frankly, by skewing a little bit towards the direction of the original vampire as kind of the default. It's not a universal thing, but there's probably going to be less influence from the really out there ideas in Mage or the really out there ideas in Changeling. Sort of move kind of in that direction. And at the same time, I think the biggest sort of counterweight to that, the biggest kind of aesthetic revision that the setting needs is to make it less Eurocentric. There are non-Eurocentric power centers and important ideas in the original World of Darkness, but it has this overwhelming theme of kind of like a certain spin on Abrahamic religion, and a lot of white faces keep popping up more than anybody else does. And so here, the idea is that sort of world folklore can theoretically be equally represented and equally mangled at the table, rather than this sort of sense of there's one kind of dominant supernatural system, and then scragglers at the corners chewing over the bones. I want to just read, this is what I was doing, I was grabbing my old vampire book off the shelf, read a section from the original Vampire the Masquerade about the gothic punk world. That's the original kind of aesthetic title for, I think it might even predate the term World of Darkness. I'm not sure if they had World of Darkness in the original printing of the first Vampire. But the gothic punk is the phrase it's meant to describe kind of what the aesthetic of the setting is. And I find it evocative, so I'm just going to read a section from that. The Gothic aspect describes the ambiance and institutions of moral society. The church is stronger because people always turn to the church in times of crisis, and enough people have been touched by the kindred, that is, the vampires, to make a difference. The institutions which they control tend to be even more conservative and resistant to change than those of our world. Architecture has a menacing Gothic flavor to it. In fact, some skyscrapers in this world might be girded with gargoyles. The punk describes the way people live. The gangs rule the streets, and organized crime dominates the underworld, and in turn is dominated by the kindred. Rock, punk, and rap are even more of an escape and release, and rebellion is codified in styles of dress and speech. All in all, the world is more corrupt, more decadent, and less humane than any suburbanite would like to believe. And along with this, we have some assumptions that we've worked out in our design document here for this particular game. And I just want to read a couple of those into the record here, remind us of them, make them available to the listening public. It's dark, dangerous, fun, and quirky. Major creative influences include the novel Neverwhere, the novel Good Omens, now also a limited series, I guess, and Buffy the Vampire Slayer. More the TV show than the movie. Aver. The game is about monsters. Not always necessarily evil, but always with some fundamental alienation to the perspectives and interests of mundane humans. And Salem is a flickering candle of hope within this world of darkness. So there's a larger aesthetic that is the backdrop for this, and then we have some more space for variance and a little bit more color and optimism that we're opening up to. And again, the World of Darkness lore is a foundation, but we're going to try and keep concepts clear and readable, both because not all of us are as equipped for like deep cut classic World of Darkness geekery, and also, make it accessible to anybody who might be listening to us. And we're going to emphasize politics, relationships, and kind of social predicaments over violence, warfare, casual street fights. Someone once described at least second edition of original Vampire the Masquerade to me as blood-powered superheroes. And while I had a lot of fun playing blood-powered superheroes when I was 15 or so, we're gonna take things in a less punchy, hitty, bitey, fighty direction.
Ooh. Bad news for that new sword relic I just spent all my transformation points on.
Do we have a new link in the Slack? Is that what I see, Braden?
Yes.
Yes.
Yep.
All right. Let's do it.
Relating to sort of the interplay between those principles and the Gothic punk definition that we just talked about a little bit, is that Salem... the way that we're playing the sort of Salem monster community in this game is as a kind of sanctuary city for a lot of reasons that we're going to sort of go into in this preface game or set of games. It's a place that is kind of neutral ground for a lot of different factions that would otherwise be bent on murdering each other.
Yeah, I think we're going to be exploring that as we play this sort of establishing game together. But that's the intent, is that Salem and its environs are, for whatever reason, maybe to be explored, maybe to be explained, maybe to be kind of mysterious, a space where there is more opportunity for cooperation, collaboration, collision between different types of monsters, and less. One of the repeated phrases in the New World of Darkness is, a xenophobic nightmare defines the kind of hidden supernatural world below the regular world. That that xenophobic nightmareness is at least slightly less mandated in Salem. There's more space for exchange and
expression.
Exactly, cooperation and just like not like knowing each other without immediately degenerating into dramatic violence. Okay, that are we good with that as a sort of description as our starting points?
Mm-hmm.
I'm good.
Mm-hmm.
Great. So for what we're doing now is we're going to engage in some group world building. We've talked about some very broad strokes, right? We identified a particular geographic area we're going to be focusing on. We've talked about some aesthetic principles, talked about kind of some underpinnings, a little bit about the game that we want to play, but we haven't gotten to all the whys and wherefores and set out kind of what's going on in this particular neck of the woods. The existing canon or the overlapping canons from stuff that was printed by White Wolf, the publisher, in past years is available to us, but even that actually does not have much to say about the northern coast of Massachusetts. So we're going to be doing kind of this game before the game, where we're going to use the rule set called the Deep Forest, which itself is kind of a remix spin on A Quiet Year, different story game. And we're going to be using, with some modification, that rule set in order to together tell the story of how Salem came to be the relatively peaceful, or at least peace possible, community of supernatural beings that it is. And so we're going to play through for those anybody listening who knows the rules for A Quiet Year or for the Deep Forest. That's usually a year. That usually covers you tell the story of roughly a year of time. We're going to be using it to tell the story of several centuries of time. In the original game, the idea is that there is a place in the Deep Forest where there used to be a bunch of humans hanging around, screwing things up, and eventually it was sort of retaken by whatever different monsters or weird supernatural things naturally dwell in that area of the woods. And they spend the year kind of cleaning things up and reconnecting with each other and rebuilding some sort of society or set of relationships. And then at the end of that year, the humans arrive again and screw everything up, and you're kind of getting prepared for that. In this game, this sort of pre-game, we're going to be using the same basic rule structure to tell the story of what happened after the witch trials. The witch trials, Salem witch trials, are our anchoring moment of something terrible happened, and now the rest of the story is the supernatural inhabitants of Salem dealing with the repercussions of that and whatever comes from that for the next several centuries until arriving at the present day. So we're going to sort of unfold the timeline together and establish not necessarily everything that happened, not necessarily everything that's important, but several different important points, important locations, important moments in time, and important relationships that will help to define what is this community about, how did it get here, and what is it doing now. Sound good?
Yes.
Sure.
Yes.
Okay, so the witch trials, in brief summation, they were a bad thing. In the very late 1600s, there was something like a mass hysteria. There's a lot of disagreement about exactly what caused them in the real world. There's an interpretation that there was some sort of accidental, effectively mass poisoning involving ergot growth on the wheat stores. I'm not pushing that idea. It's just one of the ideas that's out there. So it caused some kind of shared hallucinatory experience for a lot of people, and that might be part of what was going on. There's a political and economic interpretation that says that this was all a series of moves by certain political interests in the Salem area against other people in the area in order to seize property and kind of secure people's possessions and livelihood. And then, of course, there's just the fact that this was an insular community defined by an extremely rigid theological structure, and that was overwhelmingly paranoid about the fact that it was that these everybody involved in this story for the most part is a colonizer, a person coming in from the outside, seizing land that they don't really understand, and very deeply afraid of the fundamental kind of foreignness or opposition that they see reflected in the land and the people that they've mostly already displaced, to such that it was natural that some kind of outbreak of crazy fear was going to happen. It was sort of a powder keg waiting to blow. So any or all of those in some combination led to a series of accusations being made, mostly originally by young women, against mostly women, although not entirely women, accusing them of witchcraft, accusing them of consorting with the devil for personal gain and magical power, and to have their enemies harmed, and generally to do nefarious things in and around the Salem community. And unlike, what we might expect sort of in modernity, where you'd say you accuse someone of witchcraft, you think that's inherently nonsense. People took the accusations seriously. The officials took it very seriously. Everything that was done in Salem was done under the color of law, and there were trials held. There were, witnesses called, and eventually there were punishments meted out. And what is it? 19 people died.
Yeah,
if I remember correctly.
It gets 5 men, 14 women.
Right. It's a terrible, it's an awful human rights disaster. If there were people who were practicing indigenous or pre-Christian religious traditions or folk traditions, we would say it was a terrible example of religious intolerance, but there's no real evidence that was happening, with the possible exception of Tituba, who was a enslaved woman, probably actually, I think there's some debate about exactly her ethnic origins, but I've seen her described as possibly being Arawak or from one of the indigenous people of the Caribbean, with possible exception that maybe she had some kind of earth-centered folklorist religious practices. Even that's debatable. Nobody else was doing anything other than super rigid Christianity. This was all just people, frankly, making things up, confusing their dreams with reality, or allowing their fears to get the better of them. So it wasn't actually a religious intolerance, in that there wasn't any real religion that was being pushed out. It was just human beings being inhumane to other human beings, right? Just murdering each other for essentially no reason. So, given that this is a real terrible thing that happened in the real world, we discussed this some as a group and felt, I think we reached a consensus, and I certainly support this consensus, that it would be really disrespectful to the actual people who died to engage in something that especially the original World of Darkness loves to do, which is point to a real thing in real human history and say, oh, but really the whole time it was some magical force that was behind it, or some, ancient vampires playing 6-dimensional chess that were behind the scenes causing all these things to happen, or some bizarre otherworldly explanation for something that happened in reality. And we don't want to do that. We just want to say, yeah, this is people being terrible to each other.
We don't want to let humans off the hook for this.
Yeah,
Right.
Exactly. Human beings are completely capable of doing something this terrible. They don't need the help of wizards or vampires or whatever. So, given that, this is a thing that happened in our setting, within the context of the story. This is an event that happened. It unfolded in the way that it unfolds in the history books. All those people really did die. All of them really were blameless. There were no actual witches in the Salem witch trials, although within our story, witches are a thing that do exist, but they didn't catch any. So, within that context, we are starting from the end of that event and then moving forward. So this event is a terrible disruption. It was an awful disruption in the lives of regular humans in the actual world. Similarly, it also poses a serious disruption for the lives of the supernatural beings in the city of Salem. So we should start with a little bit of a pre-conversation about why do we think it matters to the non-human residents of Salem that this event happened. We've talked a little bit about it in the Slack, but I want to get some ideas out on the table. What do we think is going on?
Clearly, everybody's really paranoid.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, which is very dangerous. And almost all of the supernatural creatures in the canon World of Darkness have a strict code about surviving without letting mortals know that you exist, because they will turn on you and kill you all. So that is a thing that I think would put any supernatural creature in this sort of community on edge immediately.
Right. I mean, like, look what they did to regular people.
Yeah.
Right. They were ready to hang or press to death or otherwise destroy these people just on the hint of the accusation, with no real evidence that they were what we actually are.
Mm-hmm.
We had kind of discussed that, like the possibility that this inhuman act of the witch trials and executions had repercussions in other realms of existence. Mm-hmm. that this psychic scar was formed in this area that drew even darker forces to the area. We maybe will. I don't know if that needs to be an immediate impact, though. Maybe that'll be dictated by the cards.
Yeah, I think that's also part of the game setup that we're about to do.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I want to remind everybody that one of the fundamental conceits of the World of Darkness kind of ideas is the idea that there's this spiritual realm that overlays the physical world, and that spiritual realm is porous in places, or for certain people and beings, or under certain circumstances. So you can go back and forth between the spirit realm and the mortal realm. There might be spaces where the 2 points meet, so that, like, there's a location that's the same in two places. You can walk into it from the mortal realm, walk out into the spiritual realm, and vice versa. So the idea that this could have some kind of effect on the spirit realm, usually called the umbra or the shadow, could be something that might manifest over time, right? That we might not even realize at the beginning, but becomes more and more apparent. Oh, right, this seems to be connected somehow. So anything else we want to say about this? Is sort of like, this is all just kind of establishing background and getting us thinking along similar tracks, because we're going to be doing some group design and storytelling in which we make individual choices. And I think it's helpful if we have, not if we all think the same, but if we all have kind of like a similar idea set on our mind as we get into that work.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So as we start, here's what's going to happen. We're going to do a couple of steps to kind of set the table, set up the pieces on our board, basically. We have a map, which listeners cannot see, but I think we'll eventually be able to show the product of it, at least. So we have a map. In the original, sort of the conventional game, you start out with a blank piece of paper and then you'd fill it in. Here we have the restriction, but also the benefit of the fact that we have a real world space that we're using. So we have a map of Salem and its environs with some notes about both historic and modern information about locations in and around Greater Salem. Greater Salem includes all of modern Salem, Danvers, Peabody, Beverly, Marblehead, and then once you get further afield than that, it's like, yeah, there was probably like one guy who had a farm in Wenham, I think, at this period we're talking about, that sort of thing. So we have the advantage of this existing map, and then over the course of play, we're going to be adding things to the map, indications about this location here, or this, maybe this faction or this group or this individual tends to hang out in this space, or this event happened in this location. The notes are going to vary in terms of how long-term or short-term important they seem, but they're just ways to kind of flesh out the hidden world of this space that we're going to be inhabiting together with the sort of the regular game once we get to playing that. So we have the map. We're going to establish a couple of things about the assumptions of the sort of who's on the board, the who, and then also some of the what's. And then finally, the last big thing to note is that our time is determined by playing cards. So we have a deck of 52 playing cards, and they're divided by suit, so that our time is divided into 4 phases. Again, in the regular game, those phases are the 4 seasons. Spring, you start in spring, summer, autumn, winter. Here, this is going to give kind of a thematic contour to 4 phases of Salem's history. Right? The initial phase has a spring-like quality to it. We've survived the witch trials. We've come out the other side, and we're sort of figuring out how to build or rebuild, or if we want to build a community in this environment. Summer is more of like a really optimistic, growthful, exciting phase. Autumn is more of a dwindling, things are on the decline phase. And then winter is a time of hardship and generally creeping ennui. So, again, regular game, a card, which represents a player's turn, also represents a week's worth of time. Here it represents 7 years. So exactly how we deal with that is going to be real flexible, right? During your turn, you're going to say something, the card will impact this, but you're going to say something about kind of what happens in the community during that time. And we're going to work on that together, and we'll get into the how and why. Your span of time to work within is about 7 years. You don't need to cover all that time. The idea isn't that you're going to say everything that happened in the community in those 7 years, but rather to provide something that mattered in that time. It might be a momentary episode. It could be just a simple, like 2 people had a really critical argument that had deep lasting effects for many years afterwards, right? But it could also be something that does stretch over a longer period of time, really makes use of that window more, like, this group spent several years working together on, summoning a demon or something, right? Like there's space for a lot of elasticity. You just have a window to know that you're working within. And because we have this window, you can actually attach events to a real timeline. So as we fill these things in, I'm going to be marking down on a sheet what is the most, or at least one important event within this span. And I've noted, just so you know, some other important events in the history of Salem. There's not a lot at the beginning, honestly. Like, it's kind of a relatively quiet period after the witch trials. But it's an opportunity to kind of hang things on trends in what's going on in Salem and what's going on in Massachusetts and what's going on in the larger world in this period. Like, the first several cards are going to be still in the colonial era. And then we're eventually going to work our way into the 1770s, and then it's going to be the Revolutionary era. And that'll be a difference in feel. We'll know that's going on in the background, even if we don't make direct reference to it or use of it as we fill out our timeline. Questions, comments, concerns?
Sounds good.
I'm a little bit intimidated.
Yeah.
In what way?
Oh, just like coming up with good, interesting ideas that make sense and have consequence. It's a lot of pressure.
Well, the cards will have some prompts.
Yeah.
Some suggestions. This type of thing. And then you also get a choice.
Right.
This type of thing or that type.
There's a lot of jumping off points that the game will give you.
Yeah, so the card it's going to matter a lot what card you draw. The card conforms to this thing called the Oracle. I put a link to that in the Slack. So basically, the cards don't have a direct relationship, other than the suit, which provides a certain type of flavor. They don't have an obvious relationship to what their output is. It's really just using a deck of playing cards as this 52 category randomizer. But each card in the Oracle, right, each event card gives you a choice. And so I'll just give you an example of one. For instance, the Ace of Hearts, when you draw it, your choices are: the occupation left you all forever altered. Agree on something about how the humans changed you. Or one of you begins to manifest new monstrous qualities. What are they? So again, we're going to have to do some reimagining together about each of these outputs because it's designed for a slightly different game than what we're playing. We're not following from an occupation. We're following from this sort of tragic, horrible event. But there still should be a way, I think, to interpret each card outcome there. So you draw the card, you determine which of the ores you're taking, and then in addition to resolving what's on the card, you get one other action. And as a reminder, those actions are... You have a choice of 3. Uncover something old, which for this purpose means actually more literally introducing something new. It might be something that is very old, that is a repercussion of things that have happened in the past or things that stretch back before the beginning of our timeline. But it also just means any new character or group or idea or object that might be introduced in saying.
Would this also be an opportunity to drop in, if we choose, one of those real world Salem events?
So I think that the real world Salem events are happening no matter what. The only question is, are you going to make use of them?
Okay.
Right? So for instance, in 1775, Leslie's Retreat is this important event just before the outbreak of the Revolutionary War, right? Now, are we going to reference that when we hit the period that governs 1775? I don't know. Maybe it's going to be relevant to the player who makes that move, or maybe not. It's more like an opportunity, right?
Mm-hmm.
But if you decided, for instance, that Leslie is a British general, that's the guy. Leslie is a werewolf,
mm-hmm.
And his arrival and the fact that he wasn't allowed to enter into Salem town is for this, magical reason.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, then that's incorporating a real world event into the events of the game. Again, not a requirement, but it's an opportunity. It's an option. So again, go ahead.
Do you have this timeline up of actual events, or will you mention them if we hit a part in the timeline where something will be cropping up?
Yeah, I'll mention it.
Okay.
And it's just some notes that I made on a sheet here. And like I said, the first, 10 moves, I don't have anything.
Mm-hmm.
It's things like, I thought it was interesting when the local lighthouse was built, right? That seemed like something that might be of relevance to a particular character. Or the Salem Willows Park is a really important landmark in the city of Salem, and it was established in 1858. So I noted that down,
mm-hmm.
right? So if I had something for you, and Braden, you know stuff about local history too, or anybody, you might point that out. But again, it's completely your option as to whether or not that's going to be relevant to any of the moves you make,
mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
right? All that can be going on in the background. Well, what's really important is that, the ghosts and the mages are fighting over a magical baby rattle, right? It's about what the player who's making the move that time determines. So just to go over the actions, uncover something old, which really is introducing something new. Agree on something, which is actually each player is going to go around and state a position, and then we get to see if we can come to an agreement or not about some condition or need or situation that the community is facing.
Well, the player that initiates states a position, and then
and then we see if everybody can agree or not.
Yeah.
For instance, Giles Corey's ghost has got to be exorcised. He is causing too much trouble.
Yeah. In the Quiet Year, the original version, this is called Start a Conversation. But this
mm-hmm.
version of it is a little more about like someone sort of kind of more of a power play almost,
mm-hmm.
Where someone states a position and everyone agrees, or why don't I just read it? Open with a statement about a problem or issue in the community. Going clockwise, everyone else gets to weigh in once, sharing their agreement with your statement or describing what their silence looks like. Remember to indicate which monster is speaking or not speaking. That's sort of another important thing about this game, is that we're not at any point. We're not playing anyone specific, so we'll probably all be jumping around in different roles depending on the situation and what characters exist in play at the time.
Yeah, we're about to get to that point, but the thing to keep in mind is there's no real ownership. There are characters, but there's no ownership of characters in this game. So the only thing that really drives that is that the person whose turn it is has a high degree of narrative control and authority. And we're kind of look to them to arbitrate disputes. If it's your turn, you're kind of going to make the final call about any disagreement. But from turn to turn, you may or may not be focused on any of the characters or factions or whatever that you originally introduced.
Yeah. It's very possible you will draw a card that pretty much has you change or destroy a character that someone else introduced, and that's the way it goes. It's a game about the community, not about character individually.
Right. Yeah, it's I mean, this is something that as a guy who GMs a lot, I like, right? I'm like, oh, this is like it's like gamifying something that I usually do kind of by myself in the background. The third option is start a project. So state a project that the community is starting, and then as a group, you decide its duration. Now, again, this is designed originally for a game where your time scale is weeks, and we're playing a game where our time scale is 7 years. So A, that may affect the scope of projects that are proposed. B, it may mean that we're going to have a lot of one duration projects, which I don't think is a bad thing. And C, it may also mean that there'll be less project creation, and I don't think that's the end of the world, personally. So,
and I think it may,
I
think it may also like require a little bit more time abstraction in terms of project stuff. But I don't think I have a huge problem with that if no one else does.
No, definitely. We're going to keep things as fluid as we can to allow for maximum narrative flexibility. Okay. So that's the kind of the background, and then the initial, understanding, at least in basic, what the turn is. But again, before we really start the turns, we start by creating the characters, or as the rule set calls it, introducing monsters. So, as we're reaching this point, I want to say explicitly, you don't have narrative ownership. The idea is to tell a story about the community as a whole, and that's what we're invested in. But this is an opportunity to introduce things that are going to be relevant to your character's backstory. So all of you have at least the very basic trappings of a character lined out at this point. If you know that you want your character to be connected to this group or this person, you have, these things already in your head, it's one opportunity for you to use this mechanism to get those things out on the table, right? The only thing to say about that is that we're starting pretty far back. So in some cases, it may be that there's nothing that's directly relevant to your character in the modern day that's obviously going to be set up in 1693. That's fine. It just means that we'll be several turns, maybe even a whole season deep before you start to introduce any of the things that are going to become relevant to your character later on. Make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so we're on the step now called Introducing Monsters, where each of us should introduce one monster and tell us briefly about its nest or dwelling, its location, the place where it hangs out, what its deal is. When I say monster, that could be an individual, or it could also be a group. So, for instance, a coven of witches, or a gaggle of fairies, or a pack of werecats. Those are all a monster, basically.
Or a shuffle of mummies.
Shuffle of mummies, sure.
Thank you, Britt.
I think some of the monsters may lend themselves more to kind of being treated as individuals, and some more as groups. For instance, especially a powerful vampire, they're meant to be immortal. They could you could establish a vampire at the start, and it could last all the way to the modern day, theoretically, not guaranteed, but it's possible. So use your own judgment about whether you're gonna introduce an individual or you're gonna introduce a group. But again, kind of laying the groundwork for who do we think is at play in the city of Salem. So we start by introducing monsters, and then once there are at least we've got one on the table. That's not meant to be an exhaustive list. There can still be other supernatural beings in and around the setting that are present, but these are like the things we know, the most essential elements, basically, of the community. The second step will be adoptions and taboos, in which we're going to each come up with a remnant, something that has followed on from the witch trials or potentially before the witch trials, but something magical that's inherent to the environment of Greater Salem. It could be a location, it could be like a circumstance or like an event that happens every year, or it could be a physical object. These are all possibilities. So we'll each come up with one of those, and one of them we're going to designate as sort of adopted by the community. It's something it's important to the community in some way. And the other four are going to be taboo. There's going to be a sense of fear and dread or mistrust around them. And those things can actually shift in the course of play. But to start out with, so basically we're going to start with knowing that there are at least 5 monsters or groups of monsters in the area, and knowing that there are at least 5 objects or locations that have some inherently magical quality or weirdness to them that we have to deal with and navigate. And there are also things we can put on the map.
Mm-hmm.
So, who has an idea for a monster to introduce?
Werewolf.
Great. Tell me about this werewolf, Jeff.
Well, it's not just a werewolf. It'll be a pack of werewolves. I think that they are a younger pack of werewolves. A pack of werewolves that wasn't really prepared for whatever the consequences are here. The pack size is usually 5, so I think sticking with 5 is pretty fair. They have a territory here. Their territory would be somewhere that is like, I don't know how populated Salem is at this point.
It's pretty thin.
That's the impression that I got. I don't know.
There's a concentration downtown.
Yeah.
But outside of that is mostly fields, farms.
Is downtown Salem
woods.
town?
Yeah.
Yes.
And then south would be towards Boston, right?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but it's a ways.
It's a ways south. So I don't know if there's any good forests here. I figure there would be, but I'm not really positive.
Yeah, I think a lot of the space is fairly forested. At the fringes.
Then it would probably be somewhere between like Salem town and Boston. Like if I'm on my map, it'd probably be like somewhere, a territory similar to like this.
Yeah, that sounds like Salem Woods area, right? Pretty much where you picked out. Yeah.
I'm not sure what tribe or they would represent, because it's more just me not knowing off the back of my hand what's most appropriate for this area. But I figure that it would be like the Uktena or those old school werewolf tribes.
So you think they're a tribe that predates the European?
Yes.
Okay.
Well, they're of a tribe that predates the European, but that these guys are relatively new in town. That they would be here for just previous to where the witch trials kind of started, and they kind of like reach level 2 by the time it's over. If that sort of gives you the idea. But
yeah, so remember that for our purposes, werewolf, the were creature tribes are a spiritual community and not an ethnic group.
Right.
So sort of, I tried to de-ethnify these factional groupings wherever possible, because it just gets us away from some pretty gross essentialism. So I think what I'm hearing from you is that they should have a resonance with
indigenous
the
tribes.
Indigenous community more than the European settlers.
Yes,
which makes sense. So maybe I think the obvious options there are the Croatan and the Wendigo, and maybe the Obsidian Knights. I'm just looking at the list from the.
I'm looking at the list now too.
I feel like probably for deep forest purposes, we don't necessarily want to worry too much about figuring out sort of the WAD specifics.
Yes, that's a good point. Yeah. Only that there is a pack could actually be mixed in terms of its tribal affiliation.
Yeah, so it's more
so
that you want to
else?
think about their character and their sort of place in the community than about their specific mystical alignments. That's probably something we'll sort of like backfill in the transition between this game and the regular game, I would say.
That's fair.
Sounds good. Anything else you want to make explicit about this young pack?
I think the most important thing is that they are young and inexperienced.
Very good. And do you have a name for them?
Nope.
Okay.
I'll just call
Let us know if you do.
Okay, well.
Great. Anybody else?
I will be playing a mummy in the game to come. Mummies typically have an interesting relationship with a cult. Those are purely mortals who keep the secrets alive. They maintain tombs wherever the mummy rests between centuries, and have some magical knowledge and traditions that date back to where all these mummies come from, which is pre-dynastic Egypt. It's a lost civilization that inspired
Atlantis, basically.
Kind of Atlantis. But it is on the Nile, or it was. It's usually called Irem, but unless you have any experience with a cult, that name means nothing to anybody else. Anyway, so there is a little branch of one mummy cult over here in the Marblehead area, the Nesbits. This at least the beginning I'm lifting from the mummy source book that mentions the Nesbits are in Salem. They're a cult that draws whose lineage they trace back to dynastic Egypt when their name was Nebit. They don't currently have a mummy. They just moved here, but they're keeping the traditions alive. And since the witch trials, they are being very, very careful with who they tell about their traditions.
Sounds good.
So I think I've got one.
Great.
So up in the sort of northern woods, there is a cave on the shore of a small lake. And within that cave, there is drawing is hard.
Yes, it is.
There is a reclusive, hideous vampire.
As indicated by those two red dots.
For eyes.
Mm-hmm.
There's some waters because there's a lake there. I can draw. No, I can't. And he has been there for a while. He came over as sort of a refugee hidden in the bowels of one of the ships. Probably has a name. His name is Mr. Chamberlain.
Mm-hmm.
And he keeps his distance, and now he keeps his distance even more so. But he is also keeping an eye on things because he knows what it looks like when things go bad.
All right, Mr. Chamberlain.
Let me think. So my character is going to be a fairy. So I'm trying to think about what fairies might have been in the region during this time. And I guess I'm mostly imagining fairies overall as being fairly solitary because some of the World of Darkness books talk about kiths, or basically grouping of fairies that are sort of the same, I guess, like race. But in our version, they're much more kind of shaped from dreams. So although there are like certain types of fairies that might outwardly look kind of similar, there's no underlying cultural similarity necessarily. So there is one fairy here that lives
Oh,
in Salem. Oh, yeah.
well, I was going to suggest as a possibility, there are some
Mhm.
islands out in the bay that are not inhabited at this time. Could be one of those, or maybe it's a fairy island.
Okay.
There's the Misery Islands.
Oh, yeah. That they're sort of down, like, past between Salem Town and where the Nesbits are, or past there.
They're
Like,
They're
off,
out in the
no.
harbor.
yeah, off to
Oh, okay.
the east. Off the
You can
map.
draw an arrow if you need to.
Sure. Okay. So there's an island, and we'll say maybe not. Well, why don't we stick on Misery Island, because that might be interesting later on. And there is a fairy of kind of the siren-ish variety that tends to not really prey upon ships going out, but occasionally ships coming in, particularly during stormy weather. They think they're seeing a lighthouse, or they think that they're coming into port, but something happens out there and it never quite makes it. There's a crash. She feeds a little bit on human flesh, but also on human dreams, particularly like that sort of borderline between like excitement and fear. And since the witch trials, dreams overall have just been a little bit like tainted and weird. Like they just don't taste quite the same. So she's sort of been struggling with that, and I think there's a question of whether or not she's going to remain where she is, or perhaps find different hunting grounds. But for now, she lives out on Misery.
All right. Sounds good. And I actually am I'm here to provide. So we have another player who's joining us, our friend Ethan, whom we all went to college with, will be joining us for this game. And he can't make this particular call, but I did see him yesterday, and we spoke a little bit about what to, like, if he wanted to lay any seeds for the future. And he specifically wants to put down a marker on a group that's going to be relevant to his character once she shows up in Salem way later in the timeline. So this is there's a coven of magi, mostly female, and at least predominantly Verbena, which is one of the factions of magi. He did not give me a name, so I'm going to call them the Sistren of the Bitter Well.
Nice.
They hang out. So let me get my pencil.
The Sistren of the Cistern.
They, I'm going to say, have a meeting place down at the very edge of our current map. That's there. There's some old well that's long disused and forgotten. Let me try and... Oh, I'm bad at drawing, people. Very bad at drawing. Okay. Didn't do anything. Try black. There we go. And they are in explicit disarray after the witch trials, because there's been a significant falling out about whether they should have intervened and now whether they should stay. And so a large faction has already split off and left the area. So it's just the remnant that's here now. All right. Those are our monsters. Again, not necessarily all of them in the area, but important ones that will be significant later on. And we have established something about where they are and something about what they might be doing or wanting. So now we get to go to the remnants section and establish what are the weirdnesses about this area, either objects or locations or something else. What's going on? Could be connected with one of the monsters or the factions, could not be. And remember that they should be probably be flexible enough that it doesn't matter. You're not proceeding from the assumption that they're sort of liked or not, because we're going to go around after we have the 5 remnants and determine which one is adopted and what other 4 are taboo. So it should be something that either the community could embrace or could reject. Don't assume that it's going to go one way or the other when you come up with the concept.
I think we could probably start with Gallows Hill.
Mm-hmm.
Right here.
Damn it.
This is where those who were hanged were hanged. It is 2 blocks from my house. There is
so nice having a local.
Yep. There's a Walgreens there now.
It is just so commercial.
And as Google Maps tells us, also a Dunkin' Donuts.
As much as Salem has capitalized off of this history, they've done a terrible job of maintaining it. So a lot of the most important physical locations are just like, yep, it's a strip mall.
Mm-hmm. Well, for the longest time, they weren't quite sure where it was.
Right.
Like, there's a whole, like, little mid-century suburban neighborhood over there that they had to put in somewhere. So it turns out it was right next to Gallows Hill.
So what, is there anything about Gallows Hill you want to establish?
Nothing currently beyond what history tells us. Well,
okay.
I guess there's probably a lot of ghost activity there.
Mm-hmm.
Let's say that.
Yeah, I think it's perfectly cool to leave it as vague as you want. There's no pressure to it. I just wanted to check. I think if we just establish this is an important location, that makes it even easier for us to. It gives us the maximum amount of space to determine, is this a taboo or is this an adoption? Anybody else?
I have an idea. I don't know if this exactly fits with a remnant, but it's an idea I'm gonna wedge in there somewhere. There is a wild hunt that occurs around Salem. I would say about once every 20 years or so. And it, for the longest time, it was mostly one of those things where maybe you would hear, strange sounds in the forest, or, there would be hoof prints through some of the fields, but there was nothing really like, it was just something to build a ghost story on, or, a myth that people were kind of telling stories about it. There wasn't really much, no real like direct contact with anything that happened there. But that's starting to change. And the first wild hunt after the witch trials, there was, someone who actually witnessed like the entire cavalcade of like horses and hunters, riding through the woods with black horses and glowing red eyes or whatever. And they kind of, like they were there but not there, like they kind of went through things and there was no like direct contact. But I think with time that's gonna increasingly not be the case.
Okay. So I want to make sure that we do retain everything you want to be explicit about this, but don't assume any of the things that you don't necessarily, right? So the wild hunt is some kind of a mysterious event where strange riders on strange mounts appear to be, chasing through the forest after something or searching for something.
Right.
It happens periodically, something like every 20 years.
Mm-hmm.
And people are the most recent one, it came closer to the community and like it feels like it's less of a thing in the distance and more of a thing that's on our doorstep kind of now.
Yeah.
Okay. And other than that, we're not going to specify like who's in it or what it means, or that's just something we'll work out. Great.
Right.
Sounds good.
Cool.
I think that totally matches a remnant, what a remnant can be. So.
Do you want to mark like a little stag head near where this sighting was?
Let's see. I think it's going to be do we have like forest kind of all around? I'd like to put something like more in Topsfieldy, just because I feel like there's a lot happening in the south. Yeah.
Topsfield. I mean, the further you get
stuff in Beverly. Oh, just there's a like big foresty area in the sort of basically northwest of the map, or sorry, northeast.
Okay, let's do that then. I'm gonna try and make some antlers. This is a very bad stag's head.
I dig it.
It completely reads as a stag head.
Yep, 100%.
All right.
So I think that there is a space, an area in the sort of bay here that I'm sure has a proper name, where, people go out to fish there fairly often. And since the witch trials, people have been avoiding it because when they're out there, people have started having visions and hallucinations. And there's a lot of stories of people who don't come back, although no one is specifically unaccounted for. But, sometimes people will row out there to try and force a hallucination or a vision. Some people believe that is a place where you can slip through to the other side. I am not on the drawing tool. But that is sort of over here.
Mm-hmm.
And so whether that is a resource or a curse or both, who can say?
Mm-hmm.
That's supposed to be an eyeball. Oh, well.
Boat with a sail.
It's a boat with an eyeball over it.
Oh, okay.
That is my view. Maybe I can fill in the white bits. Nope.
All right.
I
am going to say there's this little tiny river or creek that's going kind of by the Gallows Hill place. That's really small. I'm going to follow it west and north a little bit until I get to this highway here. And there's also a mall kind of right above it. I'm going to say that after the events of the witch trials, I don't know what the proper term is for it anymore. In Werewolf 2.0, it looks like they used locusts. In Exalted, it's demence, but it's a natural place of power. Erupts kind of along, there's a grove of trees kind of along the bank that get this locust kind of erupts at.
Mm-hmm.
But it's specifically downstream from the Gallows Hill.
So sort of an arcane point of power.
Yeah.
Is it represented by anything human-made or anything in
no,
a weird tree?
It's explicitly natural. It's just I don't remember what forms they come in, but somebody who had the spiritual gift site would be able to see it, and people feel weird things when they walk through it. But at the moment now, it's just a brand new one that comes as at the end of the witch trials when they're concluded. Or I guess after the last witch is hung. That's when it.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So let's see. I'm trying to figure out a spatial relationship based on the actual geographical map of the area, so I don't draw things too way off. There is an actual Wenham Lake, which I think. Let's see, can I get this tool to? All right.
These roads pretty much correspond to some major highways now, if that's any help in finding your way.
So there's a real lake called Wenham Lake. It is, I think it's the southern border roughly correct. So it's about half on and half off the top of our map. And that lake, since it's definitely been a source of strangeness and eerie concern since well before the trials. Certainly, the first colonists who encountered it felt uneasy in its presence. Sometimes there is a strange fog that appears there. That when there's no fog anywhere else in the surrounding area, whispers in an unknown language can be heard in that mist, and sometimes there are odd shadows seen through it of things moving over the surface of the water that don't match any conventional known shapes.
Nice.
Creepy.
Okay, so our remnants are Gallows Hill, the Wild Hunt, this vision spot in Salem Sound, a locus west of the North Fields, and creepy happenings on Wenham Lake.
Mm-hmm.
Which of these 5 are we going to adopt as being an important kind of something for our community? Exactly what, that's flexible, but just a general agreement of like this matters. It's something to be relied on or protected or incorporated into the way that the community functions. And the other 4 will remain taboo.
My first guess would be the locust.
Mm-hmm.
I want the scary lake. I want the scary lake.
you want to be really, really into the scary lake.
I actually kind of like the idea of the like vision spot, just because it seems like an interesting place to like, quest out to or use for like illicit visions,
like a divination tool.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'm a little leaning toward the vision spot in the bay there.
I could go along with that.
It's in a pretty accessible location, right? Because it's out in the water, but it's not like the lake is way up at the edge of the map, which puts it away from a lot of the population centers. So that's useful. And if there's some sort of a general agreement that like everybody is allowed to access it, like it's a public resource, right? So you can't, even if you're like, we don't necessarily have any agreement about peaceful coexistence, but you're not going to like camp out by it and attack anybody who comes out to use it. Like everybody gets to use this resource for whatever their purpose is.
Well, the nice thing is that it's out in the middle of the water, so it's a lot harder for any of us to do anything. Like it's kind of nice as like it's almost an enforced neutral ground, unless any of us have any naval ships at our disposal, which I don't think we do.
Yeah.
I mean, Marblehead is a shipbuilding kind of community, so we'll see.
But at the moment,
yeah.
I mean, you can just go out there in a rowboat. I mean,
that's what I mean. It's like we're probably all out there in rowboats, and like fighting on rowboats is tough. So it's like
yes.
Well, I think that seems like it works out for everybody. So everything else is taboo.
Everything else is taboo. So Gallows Hill, the Wild Hunt, this locust. I'm sorry, Jeff. Did you specify anything else about it? I think I might.
I kind of wanted to leave that open for like people can fill it in.
Yeah, it's a grove, right?
Yeah.
Did you say? Yeah.
It's a grove next to River Creek or whatever that is.
Great. Yeah. There's no pressure to flesh things out more than you want to. I just want to make sure I captured your idea. And Wenham Lake. All these things are in some way off limits. It doesn't mean that nobody ever interacts with them. It doesn't mean that any particular character or faction can't choose to interact with them, but it does mean that there's the social pressure and the trend is away from these things. They're considered bad or mistrusted or a cause for fear and concern.
I think the Gallows for obvious reasons and the locust probably by association. Like I think we've all kind of assumed it shares water with the water that runs right by the Gallows. Yeah. Why the is everybody still there? Okay.
Yeah.
Looked like it was frozen. Why might we be avoiding the lake? Just spookiness reasons?
I think spookiness reasons.
It's creepy. It's on the periphery of the settled area. I mean, this might be more obvious to Braden and I than it is to everybody else, but the further you get away from Salem Town, in general, the thinner the population is here. So like there's Beverly at this time, at the start of play, Beverly has only very recently become its own official separate town. And the rest of Greater Salem hasn't broken up yet because it's mostly just individual people's farms. So all the way up in Wenham, we're talking about like there are like a dozen white people in Wenham. it's just really, really thinly settled up there at this point. So it's right out at the edge of the wilderness, and a wilderness that is very poorly understood by the white settlers, but also for the indigenous folks. This whole area got completely wrecked when smallpox swept through, slightly before the British colonists started to arrive. It was spread by French and Spanish colonists mostly further down, and perhaps the British colonists at Jamestown. But the point is, all the humans in this area have been thinned out. The white people haven't multiplied enough to take up a lot of space in that region yet. And the indigenous folks were tragically mostly killed off by inadvertent germ warfare. So it's just like an empty spot, and probably not in a good way.
So that's everything on our map.
Yes, we have a starting map. We have the essential elements in place. I think that we are ready to take a turn. How are we doing on time? Do people still have the ability to keep rolling for a little while?
I have time. My daughter is not woken up yet.
That's it this week for the Chimera. Our theme music is Hoof, Heart, and Hiss by Matt Weber. You can find a link to Matt's work in the show notes. A little insider information, these Deep Forest episodes are actually pretty quick to edit, so we'll be back on schedule here in 2 weeks, and you might even get things a little faster than usual once the season starts to come together. Hopefully, fingers crossed. And again, we'd like to thank Sarah of the Actual Play podcast Sacrosanct for performing this week's intro. Give them a listen on your podcast app of choice or on Twitter at SacrosanctRP. See you in 2 weeks.